Another economic outcome that is important to evaluate is stability. This means to minimize the boom bust cycle and financial bubbles. So we don't want expansions and contractions to be extreme, and we don't want asset values to appreciate rapidly and then collapse. That kind of instability creates uncertainty, makes it harder to make good economic decisions, financial decisions, because you can't predict the future as well. We also want to minimize cyclical unemployment and underemployment of resources. Cyclical unemployment is a result of the boom bust cycle. So what you get is in a serious recession, you get unemployment rates going up because businesses are eliminating jobs. Okay, cyclical unemployment is contrasted from frictional and structural unemployment, which are actually healthy for an economy because we're losing some jobs, but we're gaining others. With cyclical, we're just losing jobs, and people are left unemployed without much opportunity to remedy the situation until the recession turns around. Underemployment of resources is not fully utilizing our resources, in particular labor. So, you could have a fully employed economy where you don't have any idle workers, but maybe the workers are doing jobs that are well below their potential. I mean, if you have an engineer, for example, working at Starbucks because that's the only job he could find, then he's employed, but he's certainly not employed in a position that allows him to reach his potential and contribute his potential to the output of the economy. Stability also applies to inflation and deflation. We don't want them for the most part. Inflation is where prices go up on average in a market system. And it creates uncertainty if it's large inflation and it's unanticipated. For example, in the US, we expect about 3% inflation a year on average. I should say 2 to 3% now. But that's built into our decision making, and it doesn't really create instability. But if we expect 2 to 3% inflation and we get 5% or 10% or, God forbid, 50% or more, then that would be disruptive. Okay? Now, inflation shows up in market systems, but what if you don't use a market system? What about countries that don't really have prices determined by market forces? That would be centrally planned economies. In those environments, even though prices aren't going up, you still have a problem, an instability, but it reveals itself as shortages and long wait times. And I'll give you an example here. In the US, back in the 70s, we had large shortages of gasoline. Very famous period because there was a embargo on the importation of gasoline from the Middle East due to political unrest. But what happened is the government at the time, they didn't want the price of gas to continue to go up really high, which is normal in a market system if there's a shortage. That's how market systems actually remedy shortages, by prices going up. So the government capped prices. They effectively created a central planning system in the market for gasoline. And what did that do? Well, it meant people had to wait hours to get gasoline. You see, the problem was the shortage. But instead of allowing prices to go up to rectify that, they created shortages and they created long wait times instead. For our purposes, we would see both as a lack of stability. If prices are skyrocketing or we have long wait times, both are creating an environment that is inhospitable to stability. Deflation is just the opposite. That's where price levels are going down in a market system. If you don't allow prices to go down, as might be the case in centrally planned economies, then you would create surpluses. Again, we can use the US as an example, where back in the Great Depression era, prices were dropping for agricultural products at very rapid rates, and farmers were getting hurt by this, right? If they're selling a product that's dropping, they're losing revenue and going bankrupt. But the government tried to deal with that by centrally planning that specific industry, saying prices cannot go below a certain amount. They effectively put a price floor on agricultural products. And that didn't deal with the problem of the surpluses. It just eliminated a mechanism for remediating that problem, lower prices, right? If prices had dropped, then the surplus would eventually go away. But by not allowing prices to drop, the surpluses stuck around, and the government ended up having to either buy those farm products, or those farm products had to be destroyed because were perishable goods. Now, the same as with inflation, deflation can be a problem when it's unanticipated and significant. So small levels of inflation or deflation don't usually create instability. Large levels of inflation or deflation do. It's because we base our decisions on not just prices today, but what we believe prices will be in the future. If you're going to go into business, for example, you believe you're going to have certain costs today. You know what those prices are, but you anticipate what the price of your product will be in the future. You don't know what that's going to be, but if you have stability in prices, you can reasonably speculate as to what the price are going to be. So you're more likely to go into business in that environment. But if you're considering going into business and you're going to have all these costs today, but you don't know if the price is going to be high in the future for what you sell, or maybe collapse low, then you're less likely to want to undertake that business endeavor. The economic uncertainty is creating an environment that is not supportive of business activity. So that lowers our productivity, it lowers our economic growth, it creates unemployment and underemployment of resources, et cetera, et cetera. What do we want to do? We want to maximize the following. We want maximum sustainable economic growth. Key word there, sustainable, right? If economic growth is so rapid that it's creating a boom, then inevitably we get a bust. We don't want that. We want stable economic growth. We want full employment, which means no cyclical unemployment or underemployment of resources. Okay? Generally, most economists today say 4 to 6% unemployment rates are compatible with full employment. We want stability of the price level. It's okay to have a little bit of inflation and a little bit of deflation. Okay, it's okay to have some shortages and some surpluses. They just can't be extreme and unwieldy. That is, volatile to where we can't make good economic decisions and anticipate the future. Government is very much involved throughout the globe in maximizing these things. So we have what's called government facilitated stability. And you know what these are. There's monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy is where the nation's central bank uses its control over the money supply to influence interest rates, which then influence the economic activity in the country. So if we go into a recession, they'll expand the money supply, lower interest rates, and stimulate consumption. Whereas if we go into an expansion, a boom, they might cut the money supply, raise interest rates, and try to bring about a decrease in consumption. So they're using the monetary policies to influence the broader economy. Fiscal policies are undertaken not by the central bank, but by the federal government. So they use their control over the spending of the government and the right to tax people to influence the economy. So if we go into a recession, the government might spend more and tax less. Whereas if we go into a boom, they might spend less and tax more. A job rights economy is not as common as monetary and fiscal policies, but it does pop up here and there. It's where the government guarantees people a job, usually after they've been with a company for a certain period of time, and that company is a big company. It usually doesn't apply to small businesses. Best example of this is Japan's lifetime employment after 1955. The goal was to create jobs for people even if the economy goes into recession and companies experience difficult times. There are trade-offs, however, because with that inflexibility in employment, Japanese companies moved away from a straight salary model to a bonus model, where when a company is experiencing difficult times, they cut bonuses and incomes go down, but people are more likely to keep their job. Whereas in the US, we don't use a job rights economy except for teachers and judges, and that's called tenure, and that's an exception. The norm is markets determine whether employment is available or not. If we go into recession, jobs are going to be lost. But the people that keep their jobs are more likely to keep their incomes, right? They're not going to have their incomes cut or bonuses lost. There's always trade-offs, and evaluating whether one system is better than another requires considering those trade-offs. Another challenge of the job rights economy is it diminishes incentives to change jobs and maximize productivity. Sometimes we want to change jobs because there are better opportunities out there. Maybe we don't like our supervisor, there's a mismatch, so we want to find a supervisor that we're more connected with. Maybe we don't like our coworkers or the location of our job, or maybe we feel like we're not being as productive as we could in our current business firm than we could be at another firm. So the ability to change jobs is in part an ability to move up and maximize your potential. But when you're given lifetime employment after a certain period of working for a company, you risk a lot by leaving. You lose that guarantee. So less people are willing to do that, to take that risk. They stay in a company even if they don't like it, they don't like their supervisor, etc. That undermines productivity. But another thing that undermines productivity is if you're guaranteed a job for life, then you have less incentive to always work hard and do the right thing. It's a serious principal agent problem, because one of the remedies a principal has with an agent is termination, right? It's a punitive tactic, but it's very powerful. So it keeps workers always doing their job. Whereas if you can't terminate somebody, some people are just going to shirk. I mean, the people that love their job and have maybe moral incentives, they are more likely to always be productive under a job rights economy. But for the people that don't have those moral incentives, they are less likely to be productive. Okay, let's now take those economic outcomes that we talked about and evaluate the performance of a country or different countries. We do this through what's called constrained maximization. Okay? We want to maximize various outcomes subject to the economic system, the environment, and the policies. Right? Where if you look at a mathematical equation, A would be the economic outcomes, and O would be the relative importance of those outcomes, the weights. And the weights are going to be subjectively determined by the different countries. So for example, in the US, it's very clear that we put a lot of weight on the economic outcome of a real GDP per capita, right? And standard of living. But we put much less weight on the economic outcome of equity. We have more income inequality than other countries. In contrast, Sweden, they put more weight on equity and less weight on real GDP per capita. And so these outcomes are not always the same for every country. They vary, and they vary across time. Sweden has actually moved away from its emphasis on equity and sacrificed some of that to get more economic growth, whereas the US has moved more towards equity and sacrificed some economic growth. But it varies across the globe and at different points in time. We can measure the impact of the economic system on these outcomes through what are called natural experiments. And we've actually done that already with some of the examples I've given you. North versus South Korea, East versus West Germany, Cuba versus Latin America. These are good examples because we automatically control for the environment in these instances to a certain extent. We may also control for many policies, but the economic systems are different. Okay, so natural experiments don't always occur. So when we have them, we use them, and we'll continue to look at these examples throughout the course. All right, that's it. Thanks, guys.